You probably think grain needs a field, acres of land, long rows, a tractor somewhere in the picture. But some warm season crops can travel from seed to a dry, edible harvest in a container sitting only a few feet from your kitchen. And I am not talking about decorative grass or a plant that simply survives July. I mean mature seed, dry pods, hard kernels, and food you can harvest, clean, and eventually put on a pantry shelf. Now, let's be honest from the first minute. 5 containers will not replace a grain farm. That is not the promise. The better question is whether a hot patio, a sunny deck, or a small backyard can teach you the complete food cycle while producing a real edible harvest. For that, the crop has to do more than stay green. It has to finish. Containers make finishing harder than many people expect. A heat-tolerant crop can still struggle when a small root zone heats and dries by afternoon. More seedlings can mean more stems, yet less usable grain, when every root competes for the same moisture. Keep one idea in mind. Heat tolerance does not mean the plant can manufacture water or space. For most of these crops, 6 to 8 hours of direct sun is a strong target. I also want drainage holes that actually drain. Set large containers in position before planting. A 20-gallon pot full of wet mix is much easier to move before a tall stalk is growing from it. Use a loose container mix rather than heavy yard soil packed into a bucket. Leave roughly an inch of headspace at the rim, so deep watering does not wash mix over the edge. On a scorching patio, 1 to 2 inches of light mulch can slow surface evaporation, but keep mulch slightly away from the stems and still check moisture below it. Mulch hides the soil surface. It does not tell you whether the root ball is wet or dry. And the first crop I would use to challenge the idea that grain needs a field is not corn. It is dwarf grain sorghum. The first crop matters because it teaches a mistake that can weaken almost every tall grain you try in a container. Crowding. When people see a packet full of sorghum seed, the temptation is to sow a thick patch and keep every seedling that looks healthy. In a field, plant population is managed across long rows and large soil volume. In a pot, every extra stalk is drinking from the same restricted reservoir. A practical starting point for a home experiment is a stable container in the 15 to 20 gallon range, preferably at least about 18 inches wide, with 3 to 5 final plants depending on the compact variety you chose. I would sow several seeds about 1/2 inch to 1 inch deep, then thin after establishment, instead of trying to separate a crowded root mass later. Notice the word final. 10 seedlings may look more productive than 4 when they are 6 inches tall. By midsummer, those stems can turn the pot into a race for water and become less stable in wind. More stalks do not automatically mean more grain. Use a grain sorghum variety selected for seed production and look for shorter growth in a small space. Sorghum handles summer heat well, but that does not eliminate container checks. Push a finger about 2 inches into the mix. If the root zone is drying, water slowly until excess begins to drain. A quick splash may darken the surface while leaving the lower root ball thirsty. As the stalks mature, the grain head becomes the reward. But do not harvest, because it merely looks brown from 6 feet away. Rub a few grains free and press one with a fingernail. Look for filled, hardened seed rather than soft grain behind a dry-looking surface. Cut mature heads with several inches of stem and finish drying them under cover over a clean tray or sheet. For a small harvest, threshing can be surprisingly simple. Once the heads are truly dry, rubbing or gently beating them inside a clean bag can separate much of the grain from the head. That messy mix of seed and dry plant material is not finished food yet, but we will solve that problem later. Sorghum also shows why the phrase staple crop matters. You are not harvesting a tender vegetable that declines overnight. Properly mature, cleaned, dried grain can enter a different storage routine. The exact cooking or milling method depends on the sorghum type, but the container has taken a seed through the same biological cycle that happens on a much larger farm. First, look at the next crop, because it has almost the opposite harvest shape. Sorghum gives you one obvious head. Sesame hides familiar pantry seeds inside dozens of narrow capsules. and those pods can punish you for waiting too long. Sesame makes a wonderful visual break in a container garden because it does not look like a grass. The upright stems carry flowers and then seed capsules along the plant. In a sunny, hot position, a 7 to 10 gallon pot can work as a practical, small space starting point for 2 or 3 plants, provided the mix drains freely. Sow shallowly, roughly a 1/4 inch deep, and do not keep the surface waterlogged just because the seed is small. The biggest lesson with sesame is timing. Seed capsules do not always mature in perfect unison, from the bottom of the stem to the top. A gardener waiting for every capsule to become equally brown and brittle may discover that the earliest mature capsules have already opened or dropped seed. This is why I want a clean sheet, tray, or large paper bag involved before the plant looks completely finished. Watch the lower capsules as pods begin drying. Depending on the variety and conditions, cut stems as maturity advances and finish drying them under cover. Put the cut material over something clean that catches released seed. The goal is to catch mature seed and let harvested stems dry with good airflow. Then comes one of the most satisfying small space harvest moments. Hold a fully dry capsule over a clean bowl and open it. The tiny seeds that look so ordinary in a grocery jar suddenly have a history. You know which flower produced the capsule, which hot week made the pot dry faster, and which morning you cut the stem. Because the seed is so small, use a light-colored tray when possible. The contrast makes dark sesame seed easier to see among capsule fragments. Small space processing is often less about special equipment and more about choosing a surface where you can actually see what you are doing. But sesame also introduces an important rule. The jar is not the place where damp seed finishes drying. After separating the seeds, spread them in a thin layer on a clean tray and continue drying if there is any doubt. Stir them occasionally. Inspect for bits of capsule and obviously damaged seed. We will return to sealed storage near the end. Sesame teaches you to catch seed. Grain amaranth teaches you how frustrating seed can become when it is almost the same size as the debris around it. Grain amaranth is one of the most dramatic plants on this list. The mature seed head can tower above a container, and the plant can make thousands of very small seeds. But choose a variety grown for grain if your goal is a seed harvest. An amaranth planted for tender leaves can still flower, but the crop purpose and plant form are not always the same. For 1 or 2 full-size grain plants, I would start with a 10 to 15 gallon container. The seed is tiny, so sow it very shallowly, barely cover it. Once seedlings are established, thin them deliberately. Extension guidance for grain amaranth commonly uses about 8 to 12 inches between plants, and seed maturity can be around 90 to 100 days under suitable conditions. In a container, that spacing lesson matters, because one vigorous plant can create far more canopy than a tray of tiny seedlings suggests. Do not bury the seed deeply or respond to slow early growth with heavy nitrogen. Amaranth can build a large leafy plant, so feed modestly when needed and keep the crop focused on balanced growth in full sun. Now comes the harvest signal. Do not decide from color alone. Put a clean hand beneath part of the seed head and rub a small section between your fingers. When mature seed releases readily, the plant is telling you much more than a photograph can. If the seeds are still soft and difficult to free, give the crop more time unless weather or seed loss creates a reason to cut and finish drying under cover. Once mature heads are fully dry, rub them with gloved hands over a clean tray, or thresh them gently in a bag. The result is tiny seed, mixed with flower fragments and chaff. Use a suitable screen or sieve, then winnow small portions gently, rather than risking the whole harvest at once. The first time you see a layer of clean amaranth grains settle at the bottom of a bowl, you understand why post-harvest work belongs in this video. Growing the plant is not the complete skill. Tiny seed is one kind of problem. Compact corn gives you a much larger kernel, but producing a well-filled ear depends on something a single beautiful plant cannot do very well alone. Corn can look spectacular in a container. One tall green stalk, a tassel at the top, a developing ear on the side. And then harvest day arrives, and half the ear is missing kernels. the plant grew. The pollination failed. Those are two different results. Corn is wind-pollinated. Pollen comes from the tassels and must reach the silks. Each potential kernel is associated with a silk, which is why poor pollination can leave obvious gaps on the ear. In a field, thousands of plants create a cloud of pollen. On a patio, one lonely stalk does not have that advantage. This is why I prefer a wide container and a small cluster rather than one decorative corn plant. For an experiment, think 20 to 30 gallons and roughly 24 inches wide or more. 4 to 6 compact plants can make more sense than one stalk, though the exact number must match the variety and pot. Sow about 1 inch deep and space the final plants evenly instead of leaving a dense clump. This recommendation is not a magic substitute for field spacing. It is a small space compromise. The important principle is that corn benefits from neighbors for pollination, while each plant still needs enough root volume, water, and fertility to reach flowering in good condition. When tassels shed, pollen and silks are fresh, pay attention. In a very small planting, collect pollen on a dry morning and dust it over the silks of developing ears. Repeat on more than one day while pollen is shedding. You are helping a tiny corn group do what a large block does more naturally. Water consistency also matters around tasseling and silking. Check the root zone, not only the surface. Water deeply, let the pot drain, and check again before plants reach severe wilt. And when the ear matures, let the crop goal guide harvest. For compact grain corn, you are waiting for mature, hard seed, not the milky tenderness you want from sweet corn. That distinction becomes even more important when we reach popcorn. Corn needs neighbors. Cowpeas earn their place for a different reason. They are a warm season pulse that can keep moving through conditions that make many common cool season vegetables look tired. For a patio, choose a bush or semi-compact cowpea if you do not want a tall trellis. A 7 to 10 gallon container can hold about 3 well-spaced bush plants as a starting point, sow roughly 1 inch deep. For a vining type, install a 5 or 6 foot support before the stems become tangled. Cowpeas can be eaten at different stages, and that creates the central lesson. If your goal is tender pods or fresh peas, you harvest earlier. If your goal is a dry pantry bean, you leave selected pods on the plant until the seed has filled and the pod loses its green softness. Feel the difference. A fresh pod bends. A mature, dry pod becomes papery. The seed inside becomes firm, and some pods begin to rattle when moved. That sound is not a laboratory moisture test, but it is a useful sensory clue that the crop has entered a different stage. Do not rush dry pods into a sealed jar. Pick mature pods in dry weather when possible, and spread any questionable pods on a screen in an airy, protected place. Shell when they open cleanly, then remove beans with visible mold or serious insect damage. A common mistake is changing the harvest goal halfway through. Pick every pod young for weeks and there will be few dry beans later. Choose part of the planting for dry harvest and let those pods finish. A dry pod tells you when to wait. Pearl millet creates a different temptation. Once the seed head appears, you may think the harvest is already safe. It is not. Pearl millet is a warm season grass that performs best under hot conditions, which makes it a natural fit for the theme of this video. In a container, however, you need to manage the root zone as a container, not as a dry field. A 10 to 15 gallon pot can be a sensible starting point for a small cluster of 3 to 5 plants, depending on the mature size of the variety. Sow about ½ an inch deep and thin early. Here is the mistake. The surface dries at mid-afternoon, so the gardener gives the pot 1 cup of water. That shallow cycle can continue while the deeper root zone gets thirsty. When the pot needs water, apply it slowly enough to wet the root ball and let excess drain. Then, check before watering again. As the cylindrical seed heads fill, birds may notice them first. If bird pressure is heavy, use breathable mesh or fine netting around maturing heads. Never wrap a wet head tightly in plastic. You want protection without trapped moisture. To judge maturity, Rub a small sample of seed free and check firmness. Seed heads that merely look developed are not automatically ready to cut. Once mature, cut the heads, dry them under cover, and thresh them over a clean surface. So far, every harvest has been above the soil. Now the part we want disappears underground. Peanuts change the visual rhythm completely. A peanut plant flowers above the soil. After pollination, a peg grows downward and enters the soil, where pods develop. That is why a container for peanuts should not be chosen only for root depth. The plant also needs usable surface area and loose growing mix around the base. For a small crop, choose a compact or bunch-type peanut and use a wide 10 to 15 gallon container, roughly 18 to 24 inches across. 4 plants can be a reasonable experiment in a broad pot. Smaller pots should hold fewer. Plant raw seed with the seed skin intact about 1.5 to 2 inches deep, or follow the supplier's directions. Keep the mix loose and well drained. Do not create a hard crust around the plant. When yellow flowers appear and pegs begin moving toward the soil, resist the urge to dig around the crown every few days. Curiosity can damage the very structures that are trying to form pods. Water consistently during growth, but avoid keeping the container saturated near maturity. Timing varies by peanut type and climate. As the plant begins yellowing naturally, lift a test plant carefully and inspect the pods. Mature pods should be well developed with filled kernels. Loosen the mix and lift the whole peanut plant. Suddenly the pods appear beneath it. Shake off loose soil gently. Do not wash wet pods and seal them in a jar. Cure the plants in a dry, ventilated, protected place. Then strip the pods after they have dried sufficiently. This is also a good moment to compare effort with value. Peanuts use more container width than mung beans, but they give you a calorie-dense seed with oil and protein. That does not make them automatically better. It means the harvest plays a different role in the kitchen. When space is limited, understanding what a crop gives you is part of deciding whether it deserves the pot. And this is where our question changes. We have already put grain heads, seed capsules, ears, dry pods, and underground pods into containers. So yes, unusual staple crops can grow in small spaces. But now you have a different problem. A seed head in your hand is not automatically food ready for the pantry. A pod cut from a plant is not automatically safe to seal in glass. Growing was the first skill. Timing, drying, and cleaning are the second. Think about what we have seen. Sesame may release seed, amaranth mixes grain with chaff, corn can miss pollination, and peanuts need curing. At harvest, every crop asks a different question. And one of the smallest plants on the list is a perfect place to see why timing matters. Mung bean. Mung beans prefer warm conditions and fit a patio well. A 5 to 7 gallon pot can support 4 to 6 plants spaced around the surface. Sow about 1 inch deep in warm, well-drained mix and keep moisture steady during establishment. The challenge is uneven pod maturity. One group can be dry while another remains green. Wait for every pod to match, and the earliest may split, or wet weather may re-wet material you wanted dry. Check plants every 2 or 3 days as pods mature. Pick dry, papery pods and leave green pods to keep filling. Put harvested pods in an open basket or mesh tray in a dry, airy place. Never stuff damp pods into a sealed container. When the pods are crisp, shell them over a clean tray. The beans should be hard, not soft. Spread the shelled seed in a thin layer and give it additional drying time if needed. The exact time will change with humidity, airflow, and how dry the pods were at harvest. So use the condition of the seed instead of promising that 3 days works in every home. Mung beans are a pulse, so they contribute protein along with carbohydrate and fiber. But the reason they belong here is practical. They show how a small crop can be harvested in several dry pod passes rather than one dramatic cutting day. Mung beans reward selective harvesting. Proso millet asks a different question. How much processing work are you willing to do for a small grain? Proso millet is another warm season grain. In a container, treat it as a focused experiment rather than pretending one pot provides a year's supply. A 10-gallon container with 4 to 6 final plants can demonstrate the crop. Sow 1/4 to 1/2 inch deep and thin early. Give it full sun and watch moisture as seed develops. Do not let the pot swing from saturated to bone dry. On an exposed patio, a lighter colored pot and 1 to 2 inches of mulch kept away from stems can slow water loss. Before growing proso millet, ask what you will do after harvest. Do you want to learn threshing and winnowing? Do you have a place to dry heads? If not, a dry bean may give you more satisfaction in the same space. When grain is hard and heads are mature, cut them before weather or birds remove the reward. Dry under cover, thresh small batches, and separate seed from chaff. For a tiny balcony, I call proso millet an experiment crop before a priority pantry crop. A crop can be worthwhile without being the most efficient use of every square foot. If you want a harvest that feels more familiar in your hands, bush dry beans make the next lesson much easier to see. The interesting thing about a dry bean is that many gardeners already know how to grow the plant. The change is in the harvest goal. Instead of picking young green pods every few days, you allow selected pods to mature fully on the plant. Choose a bush variety for limited space. A 5 to 7 gallon container can hold 3 or 4 plants, while 10 gallons gives more moisture buffer. Sow about 1 inch deep in warm weather and water at the base when practical. At first, the plant behaves like a familiar bean. Then you stop chasing tender pods. The pods swell, the green color fades, the walls become dry and papery. On a dry day, open one. The beans should be full size and hard. If rain is forecast when most pods are mature, harvest and finish them under cover. Spread pods where air moves around them. When they crack easily, shell them. For a few containers, hand shelling is often the cleanest method. Now inspect the beans. This is a step people skip because a bowl of colorful beans looks finished. Remove shriveled seed, obvious insect damage, and anything showing mold. Then continue drying the good beans if necessary before storage. The biggest mistake is treating dry beans like fresh green beans at the last moment. A fresh bean goes to the kitchen with moisture in it. A storage bean has to be dry enough for sealed storage. The pod can feel crisp, while a recently shelled bean still needs additional air drying. Dry beans hide the harvest in pods. Sunflowers put every seed on display, and that creates a completely different problem. For edible seed, do not choose a dwarf ornamental sunflower merely because it says compact. Look for a variety bred for useful edible seed. One productive plant in a 10 to 15 gallon pot is safer than crowding 4 large-headed plants into the same root volume. Sow about 1 inch deep and give the container 6 to 8 hours of direct sun. Because a mature head is heavy, use a broad pot and add support early. A stake beside a small plant is easier than driving one through a mature root ball later. Good seed fill depends on successful flowering and pollinator activity. Avoid spraying open flowers unless a labeled product and timing specifically protect pollinators. In a small edible garden, observation and targeted management beat treating every flower on a schedule. Now, do not harvest because the yellow petals fell. Petal drop tells you the flower is aging. It does not guarantee that every seed has filled. Watch the back of the head as it changes from green toward yellow and then brown, and check the seeds themselves. Mature seeds should be plump and developed. If birds strip the heads, cover maturing heads with breathable mesh or a loose paper bag after pollination. Keep air moving and never wrap a damp head in plastic. When the back of the head has dried and the seeds are mature, cut the head with a section of stalk and finish drying it in a protected, airy place. Rub the dry seeds free over a clean tray. That large seed is easy to hold in your hand. Before storage, separate obvious plant debris and let the seeds continue drying if the head was recently cut. Sunflower seed is much easier to hand clean than teff or amaranth, but the same rule remains. Easy to handle does not mean ready to seal while moisture is still present. Teff takes us to the opposite extreme. Teff is a genuine grain crop with extremely fine seed. For a home container grower, that means the first challenge arrives before germination. If you sow it the way you sow corn, you will bury it too deeply. Use a wide container with 8 to 10 gallons of mix. Level and moisten the surface first. Mix the seed with dry sand if that helps distribution. Scatter it thinly, press it into the surface, and barely cover it, about 1/8 of an inch at most. Water gently so seed does not wash into one corner. Do not pour the whole packet onto a 10-inch circle. Dense germination can create a mat of weak plants with poor airflow and intense competition. Once the seedlings are visible, thin any extremely crowded patches. Teff likes warm conditions, but processing is the real question. Careless threshing and winnowing can throw tiny seed away with the chaff. Cut mature heads over a clean sheet, finish drying under cover, and work small batches with screens, shallow bowls, and very light airflow. I would not sell teff as the first calorie crop for a 6-foot balcony. Grow it to understand a miniature grain system and add diversity. A crop can fit a container without deserving priority in every container. And if teff feels almost too fine to handle, foxtail millet gives you a seed head that is easier to read visually. Foxtail millet forms a dense, bristly head at the top of the stem. For a small experiment, use a 7 to 10 gallon pot with 3 to 5 final plants. Sow 1/4 to 1/2 inch deep and thin before root systems become tangled. The heat lesson is familiar. Give it direct sun, check moisture below the surface, and water the whole root zone when needed. What changes is the harvest decision. A foxtail head can change color and still contain seed that has not hardened fully. Pinch a few seeds free. Press them with a fingernail. Look for filled, firm grain. If a seed crushes like soft dough, the head needs more time. Birds can find a few maturing heads quickly. Breathable netting or small mesh covers can save a container crop. Once mature, cut the heads, finish drying, and thresh over a clean tray. Now we have handled tiny grains, exposed seed heads, and dry pods. The next crop forces many vegetable gardeners to wait for something they rarely wait for: a corn kernel that becomes truly dry. Popcorn is not sweet corn left on the counter for a few extra days. It is a different type of corn selected for popping. Start with a popcorn variety that matches your growing season. In a container, a shorter season or more compact variety can make the project easier, but the pollination problem we discussed earlier does not disappear. Use a wide 20 to 30 gallon container and grow roughly 4 to 6 plants, depending on variety and pot diameter. So, about 1 inch deep. 2 large corn containers placed near each other create a better pollen environment than scattered single stalks. Do not repeat the full corn lesson. Just remember the key. Pollen from the tassel must reach fresh silks, and a small planting may benefit from hand pollination during pollen shed. The harvest goal is completely different from sweet corn. With sweet corn, gardeners watch for plump ears and milky kernels. With popcorn, you let the ears mature on the stalk as long as weather permits. The husks dry. The kernels become hard, plump, and shiny. If wet weather arrives before the ears finish drying outside, harvest mature ears and continue drying them indoors. Remove the husks and place the ears in mesh bags or another warm, well-ventilated location. Do not seal fresh ears in plastic. Here is a practical test. Once a week, shell about 20 kernels and pop them. If the popcorn is chewy, tough, or has hard edges, the kernels may still be too moist. Dry longer and test again. When most pop crisp and fluffy, the crop is close to storage condition. Extension guidance places ideal popcorn moisture around 13 to 14%, but most home gardeners can use popping performance instead of a grain moisture meter. When the ears are properly cured, wear a heavy glove and rub kernels from the cob into a clean bowl. Now you have a dry grain that can go into a tightly closed container. And the final crop brings us back to the original promise with a direct connection to hot, dry parts of the American Southwest. Tepary bean. Tepary beans are a traditional southwestern food crop known for strong heat and drought adaptation. But drought tolerance in the field is not permission to neglect a 7-gallon container on concrete. Choose the growth habit before planting. Some tepary beans vine and need support. For a compact form, a 7 to 10 gallon container with 3 or 4 final plants is a useful start. Sow about 1 inch deep. Install a 5 to 6 foot trellis, early for climbers. Do not drown the plants because you are nervous about heat. Water deeply when the root zone needs it, then allow drainage and check again before repeating. At the same time, do not brag about drought tolerance while the leaves are collapsing every afternoon. A container has less soil volume and less moisture reserve than an in-ground planting. For dry beans, the harvest process should now feel familiar. Leave pods to mature. As they lose green color and become dry and papery, pick them during dry weather. If the plant continues setting pods, harvest mature ones in several passes. Finish drying the pods under cover if necessary, shell the beans, and inspect the seed. Tepary beans connect heat adaptation with a pantry harvest. A handful of dry beans may look less dramatic than a basket of tomatoes, but these seeds can be stored and cooked later. They also remind us that useful crops were selected for specific climates and food traditions long before container gardening became a social media category. Now we have 15 crops in front of us. Tall grain heads, tiny grain, capsules, ears, dry pods, sunflower heads, and peanuts that formed underground. They look different, but the safest post-harvest workflow comes down to a surprisingly small number of rules. First, harvest according to the crop, not the calendar alone. Sorghum asks for grain hardness. Sesame asks you to watch capsules and seed loss. Amaranth can be rub-tested for mature seed release. Dry beans ask for papery pods and firm seed. Popcorn asks for hard kernels and dry husks. Peanuts ask you to inspect pods below the soil. Second, dry the harvest in moving air. A brown plant is not automatically dry enough for sealed storage. Spread small seeds thinly, place pods on mesh or trays, and hang popcorn ears in mesh bags. Protect the harvest from rain, condensation, and rodents in a dry, ventilated place. Third, understand the two words that make grain processing sound more complicated than it is. Threshing means separating grain from the head, or plant material holding it. Shelling means removing beans or kernels from pods or ears. For a small container harvest, you usually do not need a machine. A clean bag, a tray, gloved hands, a bowl, and a screen can do a surprising amount of work. Fourth, remove debris. After threshing amaranth, millet, teff, or sorghum, use an appropriate screen when it helps, then winnow tiny batches. Pour seed between bowls in a very light breeze, or far in front of a fan, set low, so heavier seed drops and light chaff moves aside. Test 1 spoonful before risking the whole harvest. Fifth, inspect what you plan to store. Remove visibly moldy seed. Remove badly damaged beans. Watch for insect holes and live pantry pests. Clean seed is easier to monitor than seed mixed with plant debris. And sixth, verify dryness before sealed storage. This is the rule I want you to remember after the video ends. The jar is the last step. It is not the place where a damp harvest finishes drying. For dry beans and grains, no single kitchen trick measures moisture perfectly in every crop. Commercial growers use crop-specific targets and meters. At home, use several clues. Dry plant material, hard seed for that crop, firm beans, and pods that shell cleanly. If uncertain, give a small batch more drying time rather than sealing the whole crop early. Popcorn is the useful exception because popping performance gives you a practical test. Try the sample. If it is chewy and tough, keep curing and test again. When the kernels pop crisp and fluffy, store the crop in a tightly closed container. For fully dried seeds, use clean containers with tight-fitting lids. Glass, metal, or heavy plastic containers that close securely help with pantry insects. Label the crop and harvest year, then store in a cool, dry, dark location and check periodically. Do not put a beautiful jar on a sunny kitchen windowsill just because the grain looks decorative. Light and heat are not helping long-term food quality. And do not mix a new harvest into an old jar before checking the old seed for insects or moisture problems. One more practical point. Some crops, especially dry beans and peanuts, require appropriate preparation before eating. This video covers growing, harvesting, drying, and storage. Use a reliable preparation method for the specific grain, bean, or seed before serving it. Now we can finally answer the question we started with. Can a few containers replace a grain field? No. A 20-gallon pot of sorghum is not a combine harvest. A cluster of popcorn on a patio is not an acre of corn. And one tray of teff will not fill a pantry. But that was never the most useful question. The better question is how much of the food cycle you can learn, and how many useful crops you can finish from seed to storage in the space you already have. A tomato teaches you when a fruit is ripe. These crops teach you to look at a harder seed, a papery pod, a dry husk, a mature head, or a peanut peg disappearing into soil. Then, they teach you what happens after harvest. You dry, you thresh, you shell, you separate chaff, you inspect, you store. And when a jar of clean, homegrown grain or dry beans finally reaches the shelf, the jar is not impressive because it replaced a farm. It is impressive because you understand every step that put the food inside it. So, if you had room for only 3 of these crops, which 3 would earn a container on your patio? Would you start with dwarf sorghum, a wide pot of peanuts, or a heat-adapted tepary bean? Tell me your 3 in the comments. And if practical small-space food growing is what you are building at home, subscribe and keep growing with me. The next useful harvest may be hiding in a container you have not planted yet.